Albert Einstein said, "Don't think about why you question, simply don't stop questioning." Welcome to Curated Questions. I am your host, Ken Woodward. And these questions are not mathematical equations, but rather a resource to encounter personal reflection and growth. As Tupac Shakur stated, even the genius asks questions. Now, let's engage the questioning community. Greetings. Ken Woodward here. Welcome back to another episode of Curated Questions. Together, we engage inquisitive humans about how they use questions to navigate and make sense of our world. I am a fellow traveler and a pilgrim on this journey, and I'm glad you are here. Today's conversation is with Bill Reed. Bill has an impressive resume filled with leadership roles across companies such as Intuit and Northwestern Mutual in the financial arena, and Sweetfish Media, helping B2B marketers produce personality-led content. Currently, he is helping Dwellspring capitalize on the success of the 12-Hour Sound Machine podcast, with over 1.3 million unique listeners per week. For the record, that's a lot. To help worldwide listeners get better rest. A consistent theme throughout his career is dedicating himself to serving others by intentionally nurturing relationships through creative and engaging methods. I met Bill over breakfast at the recent Podcast Movement Conference in Washington, D.C. He quickly demonstrated his questioning expertise through thoughtful inquiry and careful listening. I jumped at the chance to invite him to a deeper discussion about how he uses questions to care for others across several domains. Bill, welcome to Curated Questions.
Thanks, Ken. I am really excited to be here and spend time with you today.
I always like to start things out with asking folks, when did you first understand the power of questions?
The first recollection I have, solid recollection, was as a parent. I wrote a post not too long ago titled something like "Everything I learned about business, I learned from my kids." So much of what I've learned about being a leader and serving people at work, I learned from being a father. And I found that questions were a much more effective way to love and guide and teach my children. And as I learned that, I began applying that at work.
So just to quantify, kids-wise, what does that look like?
Sure. My kids are all grown up and moved away. In fact, I've got three. My oldest daughter is in New York City, works for Chase Bank. I have a boy right there in DC who worked with the FBI for a number of years and now works with a private security company. And then I have a son here in Orlando where I'm located who was with Disney for 10 years and now is on an adventure of his own. So they're in their, I would say, midlife. The other day, my wife said something about being in midlife. I said, honey, we're not in midlife. Our children are in midlife, right? So I'm enjoying that. And speaking of loving children and asking questions, that's become even more interesting to me as my kids have gotten older. Because as kids grow up, they take on other interests and they have someone else in their life, typically, who is just living life alongside them. So you don't get a lot of time. And even if you get time, it's not always quality time. So I have found questions to be particularly helpful so that I could really get to know my kids as adults.
Just dialing back on that, the learning the importance of questions when the kids were younger, and then it morphed and you're asking different questions today. But was there any particular season of time where you were like, I'm doing the telling thing, and then you're like, wait a second, what did that journey look like for you?
Yeah, I can tell you a very specific story that I have a very specific recall of. My middle son, Trevor, he was either a junior or senior in high school. And he came to me with a question. I believe it was prom season. He said, Dad, what time do I need to be home? And that's an example of where I took an opportunity to ask him a question. I didn't want to answer that question. I wanted him to discover an answer to that question. So I said, well, Trevor, I don't know. What time are you thinking? And he thought for a minute and he said, well, I mean, my friends don't have a curfew. They're staying out all night. And I said, okay, well, that's not going to happen here. So let's talk about what time is reasonable. And he said to me, I don't know, Dad, 2:00. And I said, tell you what, let's make it 3:00 and you be on time. Okay. Don't be a minute late. And, that gave me an opportunity not only to turn the tables and ask a question of him and let him engage with what's reasonable. It gave him a chance to own the answer, right? Because if I'd have said, by gosh, you better be here right at 2:00 or whatever the time would have been, that would have been my answer to his question. Instead, he had to go to his own well and say, what's reasonable, what's fair, what makes sense? And then I extended it, right? Little trick to say, okay,
beautiful.
You say two, let's give you an extra hour there.
Nice. How have you changed the questions as they've gotten older into this new season where they're at today?
Well, I love curious people, Ken. I feel like I'm a pretty curious person myself. The kinds of things I'm curious about has changed because the kinds of things I care about has changed. But my goal was always to raise curious kids. So I modeled what I would call the art of asking questions. And I did that not only by asking them questions, but I integrated that practice throughout my life, whether it was in a social context, the context of a religious community, or just a friendship. I always sought to be curious about another individual and their life. And that's not really hard to do if you're intentional about it. I mean, people are fascinating. They really are. And you just have to put yourself to the side for a minute and focus on, here's the trick I've learned. Ask a question and listen to the answer. Listen to the answer. And then ask another question based on the answer. And that's a technique I use over and over again because it demonstrates, number one, that I'm listening, that I'm hearing. And number two, it allows them to take the conversation in the direction that interests them. And when I'm getting to know someone or trying to serve someone, that's what it's all about.
You said you've been doing this your whole life. Was this something that your parents encouraged? What did growing up look like? Did your parents foster that?
I think my mother did. My dad was not curious and wasn't engaged, unfortunately. God bless him. God rest his soul. But mom was the one who checked in, and she was the one who asked questions. We can talk about this in another segment, but one of the things that always concerned me as a parent, and this happened to me as a child at times, was that questions became weaponized. I think you can figure out real quick, put yourself in the shoes of a teenager at home with parents and imagine how quickly words can become weapons and questions can become tools or strategies to get what you want. And I look at questions differently. I don't use it as a method or as a tool to get inside somebody's head. I look at questions more like invitations, right? An invitation to share what's important to you. And by the way, one of my very favorite questions is, let me put this in proper context. When I start a meeting, I typically ask, what is the problem to be solved? That's the first thing. Why are we here? We're here. If there's not a problem, sometimes it's just an update. Sometimes it's just informational. But with the precious nature of time, especially when we get face-to-face with people, I want to get right to it. In fact, there was a talk show host years ago, Dr. Laura was her name, and she's a tough cookie, but she will always find her way to this question. And it is simply, what is your question? So people will call her radio show. It's an advice show. And they'll say, hey, my sister-in-law came over the other day and she was talking about my brother and one of the kids. And Dr. Lowe will stop her and say, okay. What is your question for me? And the person on the other end will typically say, well, it was like 2:00 in the afternoon when she came over. And I thought she was, and she'll say again, what is your question for me? And so I took that technique early in my career. And whenever we engaged on an issue or a problem, I would ask the question, which is, what is the question? So
right.
that got people right to it. In fact, in my most recent engagement, when we went through issues at meetings, I would ask people to start the conversation with their question. So I don't want any background. I don't want any context. I just want you to ask the question. And it looks something like this. Should we hire a new director of marketing? Now, everybody around the table may be thinking, well, we have a director. What in the world? So that's the question they ask. What in the world are you thinking? Why would we hire? And then you get a chance to make your case and to fill in blanks. But what that does is that shifts from a 5-minute diatribe, which is typically someone processing out loud, not particularly helpful in the meeting context. And then at the end of that, people just look at each other and say, well, what do we do? Instead, if you put the question out front, all of the discussion relates to answering the question. And it's not a foolproof method, doesn't work in every case, but it's another example of how powerful I think questions can be and how multi-layered the use of questions can be.
Okay. So lots to ask. So let's start with, when you start out with, what is the problem to be solved? That can, depending on tone, can come across very abrasive, or to come in and say, what is the question, right at the jump? So what have you done to build a culture that this is a part of it and it's seen as an invitation, vice weaponization, potential judgment?
It's a great question, because when you start with the bottom line, it can seem very abrupt, overly direct, even maybe manipulative. But in a team, if the team's secure in the dynamic between leaders and others, and amongst themselves especially, if they're secure and they can transition to a very direct meeting culture, then you can really set aside any offense that may be taken when direct questions are addressed. It takes a little bit of time to adapt to, but it's part of the efficiency and effectiveness of meetings, because so many of us spend so much time posturing, right? And positioning and doing what we call providing context, when we could take a 15-minute discussion, which it doesn't end up being a discussion, but a 15-minute time slot, and you can take that down to 5 minutes if you just clarify or call the question. So I think that the answer to that is, people do have to, you got to have a little bit of a thick skin, because the question sometimes can come across startling, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And what often happens, by the way, when you move to a system like this, is that people will come with an answer instead of a question, but an answer disguised as a question. Like, we need to hire a new director of marketing. That is not a question.
Yeah.
That is not a problem to be solved. The problem is, and this is where the sensitivities grow even further, we are not achieving our marketing goals. How do we do that? How do we move from failure to success? And that's the question, really, that needs to be solved in a case like that.
And were there any particular things that you discovered that help ease that process to developing that culture?
Yeah, it happens far before a meeting comes. Culture is an interesting thing. People will say to me, Oh, we have a culture. I mean, we have a culture at our place. We work really hard on culture. And I say, well, I'm sure you do have a culture. It just
you
sucks.
Absolutely do have one, whether it's good or not. We can talk about that.
Right. And the culture, of course, is built on a foundation far beyond a meeting methodology.
Sure.
I'm sure discussed the concept of servant leadership, which I ascribe to. And if you can get there, if you can get people safe enough, so that's of critical importance, feeling safe and valued, then they can tolerate a lot of pushing and shoving. And in fact, as a leader, I like to debate. I like the pushing and the shoving. And I have a great story about an early encounter I had. I'll just share it because it illustrates this point. We'll call this gentleman, because he's a real guy, we'll call him Nick. Nick was a salesman for my very first venture. I started an agency in the early 90s and held it for almost 10 years. And as we expanded, I brought in a sales guy. And I remember specifically one day out on the production floor having a discussion with Nick about something. I don't remember what it was, but it was pretty heated. And we disagreed. We genuinely disagreed. And so we volleyed back and forth, and he pushed and I pushed back, and then he pushed. And afterwards, I remember walking past my assistant saying, we just had the best meeting. We just had the best exchange that I think I've had all week. And later that day, I got a call from Nick, and he was not happy. He felt challenged, at the very least, at least embarrassed. There may have been a situation where I could have used more discretion as the boss owner and been a little more sensitive to him. But it was interesting to me because as I pushed, he was willing to push back, but then he left the meeting with a completely different sense of how it went. I found that interesting.
Wow. I had Jimmy Smith on the podcast a couple episodes ago, and he was a big fan of friction. He's like, you can't have forward motion without friction. With that simple statement, I'm like, that is absolutely true. So it's embracing the friction and saying, okay, this should be a part of it.
Yeah, I think it's embracing it and maybe even creating it. And the way you do that with questions is you just ask a counter question. We need to expand our line of printers. Why do we need to expand our line of printers when XYZ, right? So you just ask a contrary question and you just challenge it. That also requires a pretty secure environment for people, especially when someone in authority is questioning, another person in front of other people. And that is a lesson I learned from the experience with Nick. But I would describe myself as a skeptic. In life, there are two kinds of people. There are believers and there are skeptics. And I mean, just purely in the sense of when the folks, you sit down with people at breakfast and they'll tell you a story and they believe every bit of it. And you're going, that's me. I'm the one going, I'm not so sure about that. And that gives me a great opportunity to ask relevant, and over time have learned to ask sensitive, respectful questions out of my skepticism.
What are some of those lessons learned of being able to ask helpful questions and not just abrasive questions?
One of the keys for me has been to ask what if questions. Okay. So I understand that you believe we need to expand our product line. What if we spend $4 million doing that? What does that look like? And asking those what if kinds of questions and asking for someone to really think that through the what if scenario. So that's one of the techniques that I typically use to counter someone, as opposed to just saying, I don't believe you, prove it, right? Okay. And frankly, even though I'm a contrarian and a skeptic, a lot of times I'll take a conversation with questions right down the path that someone wants to go. Even if I'm skeptical, I'm like, oh, well, that's great news. And then I'll ask a question that just goes all in. And I've learned to do that. It's just not my nature, but I've learned to do that because, number one, sometimes I'm wrong. Oftentimes I'm wrong. In my career, I've done many things, Ken, but I've done small things. I've done very focused things that probably could have been a lot bigger if I'd been more of a believer, right? More convinced, more confident, more of a risk taker. I realize that the skepticism can slow things down. And so at times I'll just go all the way through to conclusion and continue to ask questions, assuming everything they assume is correct and is going to come to pass, for example. Along the way, either I discover, wow, I really do believe you. Or oftentimes it'll lead the other person to say, you get so far down the road and you're like, oh, well, man, if we spend $4 million on product expansion, we're going to have trouble with personnel or whatever the case may be. Okay. Sometimes I push back, sometimes I go all in. And regardless, I think questions are just a great way to guide that process.
Excellent. I know that you worked in the investment world, or the financial world, and then the tax world with Intuit and such. And then you've also shifted over to multimedia companies. Where have been some consistencies and perhaps some differences between how those either worlds operate within the realm of questions?
Yep. Well, let me back up even further. I don't know if you and I have talked about this, but I started my career as a high school teacher. And I got a degree in education. I'm a musician and taught music at the high school level. Probably the most difficult and rewarding 4-year stretch of my life. And I've done some hard things in my career, but I think teaching was absolutely the most demanding. I was young, man. I was literally 4 years older than a lot of those kids. So I was still in a learning mode, but I developed a love for teaching. And I think this goes very well hand in hand with the art of asking questions. But think of this. Now I'm a drummer, bottom of the food chain of musicians, by the way. Learning as I go. I had a degree, but my goodness, there's so much in the field of music. And I had 110 kids in an ensemble that had noisemakers in their hands.
Whew, character building, yes.
Yeah, I mean, it was crazy. But I used questions even in that environment to draw out the strengths and the interests of students. And so what's consistent for me over time is that no matter what I've done in my career, I've always had the heart of a teacher, and I have valued that greatly. If you looked at my career to try to figure out where I became an expert, where I went deep, you wouldn't find that. I referred to it earlier. I've done work, as you mentioned, in the financial area, technology, the arts, of course, health and nutrition. I'm missing a couple, but they were across the board. What they did have in common, though, was that whatever my role, I sought to be a leader and a teacher. And I think I developed that heart as a young man in the classroom.
Wow. It's amazing that it's had that formative experience. I'm sure that the seeds were probably there, but it really fertilized and fed those seeds such that it could grow in all these different directions in the future throughout the rest of your career.
Mm-hmm. You know, even as a leader, I'm more of a teacher than an authority, right? I'm more of a learner than an expert. And I have always, as well as valuing the teaching skill, I have always sought to be a student. And even here now, as I find myself in my early 60s, early to mid, I think in this season of life, I'm learning that you have to make a decision for yourself about whether you want to be a learner or whether you want to wrap it up, whether you want to be engaged and a young 63, or whether you just want to be done and look back. And
Yeah.
I really believe from a spiritual standpoint and just from a relational standpoint, I'm convinced, sometimes I wonder, but I want to believe that my best years are ahead. So how does that happen? You stay curious and you take the position of student.
Mm.
And that's my priority at this time in life when there is a lot of life behind me. I'm not going to go out and start another company. I'm just not going to do that.
Yeah.
I'm not going to risk the capital that I've been blessed with over the years to try to double it. I would have done that 20 years ago. I did do it 20 years ago. I'm not going to do that today. So a lot of life and a lot of my accomplishments and things that I'm proud of are behind me. But I have to make a decision for myself how I'm going to orient myself toward the future. And that's why curiosity, questions, all of the things we're talking about right now are so important. Maybe they're more important to me now at 63 than they were at 33, because these years are precious. What I do, how I spend my time over the next number of healthy years I have to live are really, really important.
I was inspired by George Raveling, coach and amazing guy. So I think that he's like 85 or 86. And he gets multiple papers a day. He's constantly reading and he engages with students, but he is always on that cutting edge of having those conversations with people generations younger than he is. And I was just so inspired by that. The youth, the questions, the uncertainty, to always have some source at the ready where we are intentionally engaging, especially as we get older, I think is just amazing. But to your point, this phase of life, that curiosity becomes so important, because otherwise the easy thing to do is just default back. And yeah, I've done it, I've seen it, and yeah, here we go again.
Well,
but to be pushing back with the curiosity and fostering that is amazing.
When I think of the importance of pressing in, leaning in over these next 10 or 20 years, I'm no weightlifter, but I think about when you're in the weight room and you've done 8 reps, okay, you put the weight down and be done. Or you can go another 4. It's those 4 last reps that build the muscle. It's those last 4 reps that tear the muscle down so that it can be built back up. That also illustrates the importance for me of having intention over these next number of years. And, I'm in my early 60s. It doesn't matter if you're in your early 40s, in your early 30s, whatever the case. It's just the opportunity is more focused and condensed when you're my age.
Is there anything that you could say to your 30-year-old self that your 30-year-old self would listen to that could apply or accept today's wisdom?
It took me no time at all to come up with something. You know what, Ken? I would tell my 30-year-old self to be kind. To be kind. I don't have a lot of regrets, but one regret that I have, and it would have been about that time in my life, 30, 35, 40 years old, where I was kind of working out my relationship with my father. And I wish I could go back and just be kinder to him. I think that's true generally. I think the pride of life and the drive of accomplishment, and raising 3 kids, I don't know how I did that. I have a lot of grace toward my 30-year-old self, but I think I would have worked on humility. True strength comes from humility. I've lived a lot of life and had opportunities to encounter hardship that I think has taught me that. I don't know where that happened exactly, but somewhere along the line, I learned to love people better and to care more about people and less about the thing I was trying to accomplish. So that's the first thing that comes to mind. Just I'd put my hand on his shoulders, I'd look him in the eye, and I'd say, dude, just take a breath and remember to be kind. Because as they say, everybody's going through something difficult. Everybody. You don't know what it is, and you don't know why there might be conflict. But like with Nick, I would have just been kinder to Nick in my debate, because I still love a lot of pushing and shoving. But I think that I probably hurt people in the process along the way. I know I did.
Do you think that your 30-year-old self would listen?
Interesting thought. Yes, I think so. Most of my personal growth, my professional growth, and my spiritual growth over my life has come from man on man, or person on person, right? It's been one person taking an interest in me and investing sacrificially in me as a mentor, right? So I've gone to seminars. I love to read. I'm constantly wanting to learn. But life change for me came when one man took an interest in me and walked with me through life. So, and I've had several mentors through life, and I've had the privilege to be a mentor to other men. And so would my 30-year-old self listened? Yeah, I think if somebody could have spoken truth to me, whispered it in my ear, I think I would have been open to it.
Beautiful. Well, let's pull the string in the mentoring a little bit, because as you just said, that this meant a lot to you and been a catalyst for change in many cases. What did that look like, and how might your mentors use questions as you've gone through those different phases, seasons of life and such?
Mentoring can take so many different shapes. And that's part of the beauty of it, is that it can look however two individuals want it to look. For me, most of that mentoring happened out of a hunger and an interest in spiritual things.
Okay.
I had an interest in spiritual things and in business, and was able to find a vein of people, men in this case, who love God and love people and were leaders in the marketplace. Whatever your belief system, some of the most powerful influence spiritually happens out in the world, not in a church building, but out in the world. And I really worked hard to be with people who were of like mind. I remember early on going to a little workshop, and the speaker was speaking on the subject business by the book, which would be business by biblical principles. Okay. And I reached out to the speaker and I just said to him, would you meet with me? I think I just asked him to lunch, actually, initially. Gotcha. And then eventually asked him to, I didn't even know what mentoring, I didn't have the vocabulary for it, but yeah. I just knew he cared about me. He pursued me. And I think that's one of the biggest blessings of mentorship, is that not only is someone available to you, but they pursue you. I have a friend like that, not a mentor, but a friend who over the years, we've been friends 20 years. Over the years, man, Carlos has pursued me. When I've shut down or I've withdrawn, he's waiting, right? And he's not just waiting for me, but he's tapping me on the shoulder. And that, I think, is a great example of friendship, but mentorship as well. It's interesting because we have a huge number of men and women who have it in them to mentor. They have something to say. They have, failures and successes that they could invest in a younger person. And then we have a lot of young people. They might not be walking around saying, is anyone here a mentor? But they desperately need someone who is interested and curious about them in their life and will pursue them. The problem is getting those two groups together it's really difficult, because as much as I love to mentor, I can't go to someone and say, I'd like to be your mentor. That's not for the mentor to decide. It really is for the person who needs the help to ask. And that's just I have found that to be a frustratingly common problem. Most of my opportunities to invest in the lives of others have come from my spiritual background. But business in and of itself is a perfectly legitimate pursuit, right? It doesn't have to be a Bible study. It can be a workshop or a conference like we went to just a couple of weeks ago. But you take your heart with you to those things. But to bring that kind of all back around, for me, I found the combination of ministering to and caring, loving another, and learning about how to run a profitable business, those two things have a lot to do with one another. And I've benefited greatly from others who have been sacrificial in their willingness to help and to support me.
If you could say more on that sacrificial piece, because that seems like that's a component that may be talked about less or undervalued. So when you say that, what does that look like, or what comes to mind for you?
For me, the hardest thing to do is to commit to the time. So I would say that time is a sacrifice, because these men who were building into my life, maybe they already had their family and their family was off on their own. They were willing just simply to take the time. And developing another person, the mentoring process takes time. You know how we talk as parents about quality time. I've always felt as a parent and as a mentor that quality time really is quantity of time, right? You've got to spend time with people in order to make a difference in their life. And so I think the biggest sacrifice is just the sacrifice of spending the time with someone on issues and opportunities that they care about. And to do that without an ulterior motive or objective. Because again, in business, we're constantly talking about methodologies and strategies and techniques to build our business. Think about networking, for example.
Absolutely.
That's just filled with all kinds of complicated motives. But mentoring is a very selfless kind of endeavor, where I talked about safety earlier in the context of a team, but really, really important here as well, where a person can just relax into the presence of someone who is willing to share their life.
Yeah. In the world, we have been disconnected. There's a lot of different ways that we can be divided. And then with the loneliness factor that's peanut butter spread across all of life in modern day, this really is a way to check many boxes of caring for others, kind of doing the pay it forward, but backwards, if you will. And I'm thinking more towards the encouragement for mentors at this point to look for opportunities and to be open for opportunities, recognizing that, there's a sacrifice. Consider what are ways to be able to serve the younger folks in some capacity. And younger is very nebulous term.
I think for those listeners who want to mentor, the best way to get started is just to start. And the best way to do that is to show interest in another man who maybe you're one season of life ahead in. Doesn't mean you're superior to them or better than them or that you know more than them, although that's often the case. But it just means you're a couple steps down the road ahead of them and can help them maybe anticipate some stumbles or opportunities that are coming up. And I think the easy way to do that is just literally just, if you have a chance one-on-one to say to somebody, I understand that you're starting a business. I'm really interested in what you're doing. I'm curious. Can I buy you a cup of coffee? That's all it takes. And then, as with any relationship, then it either clicks and there's value and connection, or there isn't. And one of the reasons that people give up on mentors is because it doesn't usually work the first time. And it often doesn't work the second time. So it's something that you've got to if you're committed to it, whether you're the mentor or the mentee, you have to give it time, and sometimes you have to try more than once.
When you say try more than once, is that meant with that particular individual, or just the process and find somebody new?
I think it depends. Typically, that first cup of coffee is pretty informal and just like you do on a date, if you remember back in those days. And so things go well and you have a connection, you ask for another date, right? You say, hey, I've really enjoyed this. It's been interesting to get to know you a little bit, but I want to hear more. And that's the mentor. The mentee is, wow, this has been super helpful. Is there a possibility that we could meet again? And it takes courage. All those things take courage, and they are all outside of the typical person's comfort zone. But once that clicks, once something like that happens, those relationships can last a lifetime.
Beautiful. Are there any particular questions that you have found helpful as you've been on either side of that mentoring relationship?
Yeah, there are just a couple of super general, and they're not magic questions. But the first question in a mentoring relationship is, I'll give you the question and I'll tell you why I like it. Sit down with a guy, have a cup of coffee, and the first thing I'll typically ask is, Ken, how you doing? Which sounds like a terrible question, right? But I like it in the same way when I interview someone, I like the question, tell me about yourself. I hate answering that question, but I like asking it and listening to the response, because people will go one in a work environment, they'll go one of three ways, and you'll know right away what's top of mind, or you have a pretty good idea. With a mentoring situation or even a friendship situation, asking a very general question gives people an opportunity, because, there are a lot of people walking around with broken hearts, busted souls. And so you just ask the easiest questions, the softball question. How are you doing? What's on your mind? What's going on in your life? And if you ask that question with sincerity, so tell me what's going on in your life, as opposed to, so what's going on? Right? It makes a big difference. And then listening. And that's where the skill of repeating questions or listening and asking related questions is so powerful. If there's an opportunity for real life connection, a heart connection between two people, you get past the pat answers pretty quick. Oh, good. We're going on vacation next Wednesday, so I'm busy. You get through those things. And then one of the best techniques I've found with a question is to add the word really to the end of it. So how are you doing, really? It's a great question, because what I'm saying is no. Busy isn't going to cut it here.
Yeah.
How are you doing, really? And you can add that addendum to just about any question where you want to go deeply.
Yeah.
You want to go deeply quickly. Another question I really like, this comes from Andy Stanley. Andy uses this question often, and I've used it as well in the right context. So based on your past experiences, your current circumstances, and your future hopes and dreams, what's the wise thing to do? So as we're trying to make decisions, recently I've worked with 3 different men who are in the early processes of divorce. Very, very difficult season of life. And the question is, Joe, based on your past experience, your current circumstances, and what you hope and dream for, what's the wise thing to do now? And that's a big, deep question that goes way beyond those early questions like, hey, what? And I think it's a great question for someone who is at a crossroads or who is coming for the advice with the question, what do? I don't know what to do. And that brings some clarity. And I like that he asks it that way. What's the wise thing to do? Not the right thing, because that can look a lot of different ways. But
Yeah.
with wisdom, what's the wise thing to do next? So that's another question that I love to ask. I don't get a chance to engage at that level often, but when I do, that question cuts right to the chase.
I also appreciate that question in that it gives the person that's wrestling with it the space to prove that they have an answer. It's coming from within them. It's not, you've asked me a question, I'm giving you the answer. Now, whatever they come up with, you can work with that and massage it or whatever that looks like. But now when they go home or they're in the car afterwards, they're like, yeah, that was my answer. That wasn't something that somebody gave me. And I would assume and hope that would give further courage and for making follow-on decisions in how they're going to walk through whatever the difficult thing is. Because now you're giving them an opportunity to remind them that you do have answers within you. And there's the ability to trust in some of those answers.
Yeah. It also allows them to really put the answer in context. Let me look back and see what happened last time I did that or what I saw happen. And then today, given the fact this would be a great way to go, but given the fact that I'm in this circumstance, that's not a viable option. And then the one I love the most is future hopes and dreams, because we all have them. And how is the decision you make today going to affect your future? It's profound.
And just being able to give folks that space to be able to sit with it, think it through, that in itself is a gift.
I agree.
It's just like, hey, let's make a container, block out the rest of the world. We're here. Let's have this conversation. And let me be the witness to you as you come through this. Because there's no other spaces, right? There's home and work and that's it. But let us create a container.
Right. And that's exactly what it is. That's well said.
Maybe taking you back to your 30-year-old self. Were there any questions that you can remember or perhaps put yourself in that place of that you were asking, working through at that time that would have been helpful?
Yeah. I'm looking right now because I keep a list of questions. I keep lists of lists of lists. I have my whole life quotes. Oh my gosh.
I love you, man. That's beautiful.
Yeah.
I love lists of questions.
Well, I love questions. So I write them. Yeah. I keep them just like I do quotes. And I'm looking right now for one in particular. Let me see if I have it recorded here. Yeah, I do. Good for me. This actually became a LinkedIn post that I wrote. And here's how I phrased it, though I borrowed this from another. Your leadership has an expiration date. So do you. One day people will gather to celebrate a career. They'll either have a deep well to draw from, or they'll have to make stuff up. What do you want them to say? And that was adapted from one that's even more profound, which said, one day people will gather to celebrate your life. They'll either have a deep well to draw from, or they'll have to make stuff up. And what do you want them to say is the question. And again, such a profound question. Now, I don't want to live my whole life based on what somebody says about me. And there's a whole discussion that can be had around legacy, which I have, I think, a different view of than most. But it's a thought-provoking question. What do you want them to say? And that does inform your priorities, your relationships, your decisions all the way throughout life.
In recent years, gone to different funerals as I think about the wells that people have drawn on. It's a great picture. A couple different folks in particular, anyway, that they've just really served people and poured out their life for others and in their various capacities and domains, and just really made a difference. So, yeah, deep wells, those were drawn from.
So another, it's not a specific question, but I alluded to it earlier. And I think one of the most helpful lines of questioning can be super generic. Like, tell me more about that. You said something earlier, which, I mean, you're a master questioner, but you said, let's pull on that string. I love that. I often think people want to hear from me. They want my opinion. And a lot of times, Ken, they just don't. They just want to talk. They just want to process. And it's a gift to just say, really? Now, how did that happen? Or, wow, how did that make you feel? You don't have to be a rocket scientist to use questions to serve people and to love people. If folks are thinking it takes some kind of sophisticated approach, it doesn't. The number one most important thing is, are you really interested in people? Are you really interested? If you're not, maybe somebody else can help them. But you can develop I'd call it maybe a habit more than anything else, just a practice of listening and asking questions. And you get better at it really fast if it comes from a genuine desire to know and understand, to learn.
Yeah, a great point on the genuineness. Would agree, you can get better quickly, but the intent that's behind it really is other focused. Like you say, curiosity is the key thing. And there's multiple different ways curiosity can be driven. Even in preparing for this conversation, it was like just looking at background and saying, because I haven't lived that life before. So I wonder what it's like. How might that have been? Hard parts, easy parts, what does that look like? We only get one life to live, but getting to encounter the lives of others and hearing their stories, now I can live many lives.
And the legacy that I value comes from the questions I've asked and the investment that I've made in other people, because that's going to last a lifetime, and they'll reinvest that in others. That self-discovery, the others awareness, the kindness of heart, all those things that you can impart by showing interest and asking questions. That's a legacy. They're not going to remember your name, but that doesn't matter. Nobody, your great grandkids aren't going to remember your name. So the question is, what truth can you connect them to? What love can you share with them that will live on?
Lovely. As you've mentioned curiosity often, and Lynn Borton, she's got a podcast called Choose to Be Curious. And one of her common questions is, what is your curiosity practice? As you've said, you choose curiosity. Is there any particular way that resonated? And this is how I practice that?
Yeah, there really is. So early in life, when I wasn't as connected to my own heart, if you will, I would want to share experiences. So somebody would share something, and maybe I ask a question, they share, and then I want to relate to it. And that's with most people. They're like, oh, my uncle used to have one of those blue Corvettes, and when he drove that thing, right? And what did you just do? You stole the opportunity for them to share their story. Just miss an opportunity when you do that. So one thing that I'm very curious about is people's motivation, the why. Interesting. And I use that word a lot because it fits. So that's really interesting. Why did you choose that? And people love to talk about why. And again, speaking of the fact that it doesn't take a lot of skill, you can ask any of the how, what, why, where kinds of questions. It goes back to exactly what you said a moment ago, which is it really depends on, and people can read, people can read others well. They know whether you're just passing the time or really, really interested. I just think the most powerful of those questions is why. So why did you choose a career in engineering? Why did you leave home at 18? So why did you decide to move to Orlando? All of those kinds of questions bring just another level of depth to the surface immediately. Because when you're asking me why, I'm sharing real stuff.
I think that there's an opportunity here. I want to come back to when you were describing the Corvette and, oh, yeah, my uncle has that Corvette. I'm certainly tempted to it. Absolutely. So, pot calling the kettle black. I own all of that. I just want to foot stomp that opportunity for for listeners, myself, to resist that temptation and not make it about us, but to do an experiment for the next hour. Make it small, right? Make the experiment executable, or the next conversation. I am intentionally going to pay attention to not jumping in and trying to express how I relate to that story by one of my own stories, and just watch how it happens for the other person to truly be the star of the moment. If we're going to show up in the world and express this care, that's just an amazing way to witness.
And really the only way to counter that, because it's just natural, especially when you click. I mean, when you and I
Absolutely.
met at breakfast, we were going 100 miles an hour back and forth and sharing experience. And that is such a natural way just to get to know somebody and build friendship. But if you're really in the mode of trying to draw someone out or really get to know them, it's just every time that comes up, that blue Corvette, you just set it to the side and you come back not with a story, but with another question, which, by the way, can get a little cheesy too. I mean, when somebody's just going, I'm not going to do anything but ask questions. And that's not super genuine or effective either. But I think when I'm tempted, because I always am too, Ken, I'm tempted just to relate. Oh, yeah, me too. And then it all becomes about me. And it's unfortunate, because here's the truth. They're not interested in you. They're interested in their own story. And you can't always just take that at face value and move on. There's growth from that point. But I've been amazed at the number of people who I meet for the first time. I ask 4 or 5 questions. I know where they live, who they're married to, how many kids they have, what their kids do. And they don't know my first name or they don't know where I work, or they don't know what I care. And we'll walk away from that meeting. What's really interesting is they will say, I really like Bill. He is a great guy. He's very interesting. When my kids were growing up, I always used to say, people are much more fascinated by themselves than they are with you. But the reality is, at the risk of sounding crass, your stories, your data is not interesting to them unless they're intentional. And I knew when I sat down with you, I was talking to somebody who understood, not so much questions, because I didn't know until you explained that to me, but there was a different dynamic there. So when you get somebody who understands and practices the art of questions, that's for me where it's especially fun, because it gets a little exciting sometimes, being the one to constantly ask and constantly draw, and then you walk away and you bless them and they've had their opportunity, but you have to get that too. Somewhere.
Absolutely.
Somebody has to. I think I heard from one of your guests as I was listening to the podcast, how powerful it is when someone can speak and share. My grandchildren are in a range from basically 3 to 8. And it's amazing to me how much a child needs just simply the time and attention of a parent or a grandparent. Hey, Grandpa, watch this. Grandpa, look at me. I can hold my leg up for 3 seconds. Hey, Grandpa, watch me throw this. Hey, Grandma, see how fast I am. I mean, constant affirmation. And really, it doesn't change a whole lot as an adult. We still need some of that same, it's not as raw, but we still need, we need somebody to connect to and to be genuinely interested in. I just wrote Carlos, my best friend, a note yesterday saying how much his friendship means to me and how I don't know how I'd do life without Carlos, because he is a constant companion and he's interested. I mean, he listens to my stories. He wants to know more. And so we all need that. We can get really good at asking questions, but we also have to find ways to connect our own heart and to be heard.
Very much social creatures, right? And it's the desire to be seen and to known and belonging. If we're going to be healthy, it's the put your own mask on type thing. Make sure that you've got a conduit where you can be listened to, really, even for your health. Let's talk about right now questions. For listeners, let me introduce this concept. I was thinking about the evergreen content that we have. And evergreen, I mean, you can dive into it at any point. It's not based on current events and such. That exists for the website and certainly for these podcasts episodes, or my intent is that you can drop into them and they'll always apply. Then there's this concept of what is your right now question? This is not something that expires as quickly as what are you going to wear today or what are you going to have for lunch, and not quite the questions of who am I going to marry or if you're going to get married at all. This is more about introducing this concept of right now questions that you and I can say, these are the question or questions that are active in my life right now. And the intention here is to expand this out. You'll see this pop up across the Curated Questions ecosystem, but wanted to do this introduction here so everybody knows what right now questions are. And this is an opportunity to ask Bill, what is your right now question or questions that are significant in your life now?
Yeah. So Ken, I like to go deep. I like to connect at the heart level. So I have a question that I love to ask. It's not appropriate in every setting, but it provides a wealth of insight and an opportunity for further understanding with someone. And here it is. It's simply this: what breaks your heart? What just breaks your heart? For me, it's the fact that millions of children die every year because they don't have access to fresh water, clean water. So clean water, it just breaks my heart to see that happen. And that it should certainly inform the investment we make and the actions we take in life. There are a lot of related questions around that can be asked, but that one for me gets to the very depth of it, because whatever it is that breaks our heart should motivate us to act. So that's my right now question. Another one that would be a little less intense is what makes you angry and why? So driving, a lot of guys have this, a lot of people have this, but people on the road make me so mad. And I am truly out of character when I'm behind the wheel. And I'm a total hypocrite. I'll pull out. This happened the other day. Pulled out in front of somebody and they honked at me. And I thought, you got to be kidding. Slow down, enjoy life, relax, right? And then I'm driving along, and less than a minute later, somebody pulled out in front of me and I honked at them. And so, I mean, how much more of a hypocrite can you be than that?
Yeah.
And I think what makes you angry is a middle of the road question that gets quickly to the heart of the emotional piece for someone. The other one that I like a lot is, what are you passionate about? And this is a significant question in my life, because I lived in Omaha, Nebraska. I had a new friend, Rich, at work, and we went to Taco John's, the best taco place in the country. We went to Taco John's for lunch almost every day. And I remember saying to Rich, I remember exactly where we were. I could go back to the booth. And I remember saying to him, Rich, every man, every woman has a passion. What is your passion? And he said, what's yours? And I couldn't answer the question. I could not answer the question. I was much younger and life looks much different today, but it was a profound thing because I thought I was so clever for asking it and so wise for realizing it. And then, dang it, I could not answer that question. And that absolutely had a profound impact on how I invested my life and my time in my early 30s.
Appreciate you sharing those. What comes to mind on that passion one, because I've struggled with that myself. And one of the sub-question with that is, why don't I know it? Not so much as a judgment, but it's like, what true or false constraints have I allowed to influence this that may have stifled whatever that passion is, such that I don't feel safe in expressing what that is? And it's been hidden because it's not an appropriate passion. It's not acceptable to the group that I'm hanging out with. That's because of my struggles with wanting to be liked has been crippling for me. And so that very much falls into that category of, oh, if you want to be liked, then you have to have a passion that everybody else likes, which is a fallacy. Right?
Well, and not only that, Ken, but if you have a passion, shame on you for not living it out, right? There's a judgment in there that comes immediately for me. What's your passion? In fact, it hung me up as I was sharing the clean water thing. I think, what am I doing right now to help promote the health and welfare of children that don't have clean water? Actually, if you go back and listen to that, I hesitated in the middle of that because there is a check when somebody asks your passion. You very quickly want to line that up with life and say, if serving God is my passion, where am I in that? Right. So,
yeah. We also want to look good in the eyes of others and also self-wise. And so it's like, I'm doing everything that I can. I am changing the world. I alone am doing this. Yes. Yes. Right. Let's shift to one of your current projects. I was excited about what you and the Dwellspring group are doing. I was blown away by first I was caught off guard by the success of it and what you're doing, but also the aficionado of great sleep. Can you give a little bit of background?
Yeah, I'd love to. Let me say disclaimer. First of all, it's not my project. It's my son's project, but I have happily joined him in attempting to expand the opportunity. Let's say it that way. Brandon was with Disney for 10 years, really loved Disney. And I would imagine he thought he might, go the whole 9 yards with Disney. But he started a podcast, interestingly, and it is called 12-Hour Sound Machine for Sleep, No Loops, No Fades. Not a very sexy title for a podcast, but it does the job. It does exactly what it's intended to do. And that is it gets people who are interested in Sound Machine to the podcast. In fact, so much so that 3 years ago, this didn't even exist. Brandon developed this for his son who was having trouble sleeping. And Brandon's pretty handy technically. And so he just created a 12-hour podcast, which if you think about it, that in itself is way outside the boundaries of the way we think about podcasts. Podcasts are 30 minutes, an hour, hour and a half at the most. So now he's got a 12-hour, 1 gigabyte file of white noise, brown noise, pink noise. And it's working. And he shares it with a few people online. Some people through Patreon donate here and there. And he's making a little bit of change on the side. And then somehow it just blew up. And he went from a few thousand listeners a week to hundreds of thousands of listeners a day. And
Amazing.
his podcast is now the number one most listened to sleep podcast in the world. It has provided him financially with an opportunity to develop that product full time. And so the podcast, I mean, it's noise. So it's grown over the years, but imagine he has virtually zero cost to produce the podcast.
Yeah.
Doesn't have to do new episodes. Doesn't have to do an episode a week, an episode a day, an episode a month. He has added new sounds. So I think there are 230 sounds in the catalog today. But what he's done is he's gone on to build an app which will capture revenue from users in a different way than what the podcast can do. The podcast generates revenue through ad revenue, and the app itself will be a product that people download and pay for. So his opportunity, I think, to build the business over time is really going to be focused more on the app. But imagine he has 250,000 downloads a day, meaning he has an audience of 250,000 people who, even if he doesn't advertise on behalf of anyone else,
right,
he can advertise his app, and he has what all of us want, and that is an audience.
Yeah.
And it's really been a blessing for him and for his family to have that opportunity. And it's been fun to watch. I think he is nearing 200 million downloads total. He'll probably pass that here before the end of the year, if not the end of the month. So it's been fun to watch that happen and to watch him build a career in corporate America and then have an opportunity to transition that to more of what he saw growing up. All of my kids have an entrepreneurial heart, and all of them have worked in the businesses that I built over the years. So it's really fun to be working with Brandon now, since, of course, he worked for me.
Yeah.
Now, in essence, I'm working for him and trying to connect people who have a message with an audience that is willing to hear it. So that's my job, is to try to get the word out to advertisers on the podcast so that they can take advantage of, you said at the top of the podcast, how many a week? Something like 1.3 million.
Yes.
If you do the math.
Yeah, 1.3 million unique listeners per week. That's just staggering. Well, so let's touch on how people are using it, right? Because I know that this is one of the things that I just wanted to highlight, and almost as a PSA where there's some targeted folks that this is like legitimately helping. So want to be able to set up the platform opportunity for you to say, hey, look, for those that in this category or have family, friends in these areas, this may be a benefit, regardless of all the other components that we'll talk about here. But can you touch on that?
Yeah. I think there are two opportunities. One is for people who, we all sleep, right? When my kids were little and being potty trained, I bought them a book called Everyone Poops. I thought we should write a book, Everybody Sleeps, because everybody sleeps, but a lot of people struggle with sleep.
Yeah.
And the biggest audience here is individuals who just need sound in order to sleep, and specifically infants, babies, toddlers, children, who my grandkids, I think they all sleep to a sound machine of some type. And we sleep to a sound machine. For the hundreds of millions that do, a podcast is an alternative method. Some people have physical machines. Some people have apps, and some people find him on their podcast. So really anyone who has difficulty with sleeping, enjoys sounds anywhere from a fan motor to a train going across the tracks to jungle sounds. And the way he's got his app set up is you can curate those sounds, combine them. You can turn the volume up and down on each of the sounds. It's pretty sophisticated on the app.
Gotcha. Cool.
The podcast itself is pretty well stocked with standard mixes. But I am in the process, Ken, of determining the audiences, specifically the niches, because obviously as I go to advertisers, certain types of advertisers want to reach certain types of audiences.
Yeah.
So there are off-shift workers, people who work a second or third shift and have to sleep during the daytime. That's a big audience. Parents is probably the biggest, moms in particular, who are putting their little ones down. And then just beyond that, there are probably 6 or 8 categories of people that typically use apps like this.
Okay.
And as we identify those, then the opportunity for advertisers is to, I don't know about you, but I've never heard of a podcast reaching that many people.
It's staggering. So yeah.
If there's a need out there to reach the kind of people who use these apps, or these podcasts, then there's an opportunity for companies, organizations, anyone really, to reach that audience instantaneously. The average user of the product listens to the podcast 2.6 times a day. So there's opportunity for brand building, which I think is where the real play is over time. So whether you sleep and need some help, or you have a message and you want to get it to literally millions of people in this medium, I think there's lots of opportunity available.
Beautiful. And in that story, I also appreciate how Brandon used this medium in a new way. As we were kicking around questions at the breakfast table about that, it's like, so we just don't think about, as you say, podcasts are X number of minutes, we listen to them and off we go. But to think about, how might this be used in a different way? Yeah. And then clearly he's able to capitalize on this, and it's just been a runaway success, which I only applaud him for. I'm just so excited for him and wish him all the best on this as you guys take it to those next levels. But
by the way, you could almost re-engineer his process to the kinds of things we've been talking about for the last couple of hours. Questions. What if a podcast was 12 hours long? Asking those contrary questions that are outside the boundaries of common practice. That's what Brandon's really good at. He's learned to do that really well over the years. I think that's part of the skeptic he inherited from me, saying, why are we doing it? Why can't we do it this way? And then just part of the opportunity focus. My kids joke because they say we can't go out to eat and not think about what we would do differently. We're constantly analyzing, because I did that as they were growing up. I'm like, see, now if she was over here, then they wouldn't have to walk all the way around the coffee pot to get to it. Doesn't matter what it is. We all think we've got a better way. And that's exactly what the podcast was birthed out of, a better way.
It's amazing. Well, cool. I want to be respectful of your time. A couple wrap-up questions for you. Do you have any thoughts or encouragements about questions that we haven't explored on these edges that you were thinking of as we came into the conversation that we haven't had a chance to kind of talk about?
Well, one thing I really wanted to say is, Ken, this is a really good podcast. I listened to several episodes just in preparation today. I should say segments of episodes, but I made a note to myself. I'm a big podcast fan. I've been listening to them for years and years and years. And it's pretty rare anymore that I'll go back to something or make a specific attempt to listen to a new podcast, because I have my favorites and I have the set and I listen to them. But I am definitely going to go back and listen to these other episodes that you've done. It's fascinating to me. And I think it's so helpful for people to think in a different way, to use questions to get outside themselves and into the lives of others. So I applaud you. It's very well done.
Thank you.
And I'm going to enjoy it myself.
Excellent.
Beyond that, you're welcome. I wanted to get that out so bad I didn't listen to your question. So tell me again what you're...
So, thank you. So we'll take the moment. Thank you for that encouragement. And it really does mean a lot to me, because I know that you've been in the space.
Yeah.
I am very grateful for that. And I will continue to do what we're doing here, helping the questioning community engage and to be able to grow and to learn. So thank you. Back to the question. That was, do you have any other thoughts or encouragements about questions that we hadn't explored?
I'm trying to think of it from a different angle here for a minute and think about how I respond. We talked about authenticity, but about transparency. And I think questions are a great way to invite someone to be transparent. So I'm thinking to myself, as we're talking about the techniques and the approach to questions, I'm thinking, how forthcoming and transparent am I when I'm asked a question?
Yeah.
And so I'm thinking about the opportunity when someone asks a question, even if it's, hey, how you doing? Or how did you have a good week? Answering it maybe differently. And more transparently. And then also taking advantage when I'm asked a question to return a question, right? Something more than pretty good. How was yours? Other than that, do I have thoughts about other questions? Man, I just love what you're doing. I just think questions are so important. And I think we can get better at asking them, and we can bless people and invite people into meaningful relationships with questions.
Beautiful. That is the goal. Absolutely. Where are the best places for folks to engage with you or reach out to you or find you out there to find out what you're excited about?
Yeah, the best place is probably LinkedIn.
Okay.
I've got a profile out there. I'm right near that retirement age. So I'm at that spot where I talked about staying young, and I want to do that. But where social media is concerned, I'm just not as motivated or interested as I once was. I don't even have Facebook, but I maintain a profile on LinkedIn under the name William Reed.
Okay.
My direct email address is simply william@dwellspring.io. And you'll find me at one of those two places.
Excellent. In the show notes with all the links, I'll make sure to have your LinkedIn profile, so it's easy for folks to find on that front as well. Bill, thank you for sharing your experiences and how questions have played such a key role in your life and career. I am grateful to those who have joined us on the other side of the speakers. Thank you for being here. This has been such a memorable conversation. Bill shared how he has used questions to engage and to care for those he has led and encountered along life's journey. For all of us, please take all you have learned here and be a light to yourself and those around you. Gratitude shout out to Beauty Pill for the show's music and producer Ben Ford for the technical help. This episode was recorded on Piscataway land. Please engage with this episode in some manner. Download, follow, save, like, share, or comment about something that resonated. This action ensures we are engaging the questioning community. Until next time, keep questioning.